keep you there and no one will know, because you'll be deep in the forest where nobody can hear you scream.
Growing up with a Mexican grandmother in Southern California, I grew up listening to tales of El Diablo, the devil, fantasmas, ghosts, most notably La Llorona, the spirit of a woman who lost her children and wanders the night, looking for kids to claim as her own. My family would use this story as a way to make sure the kids wouldn't be out late at night. I also grew up hearing about duendes or gnomes, though not just from my abuela, grandmother. My grandmother would tell stories of duendes playing tricks on people in the forest. She told a story that she once saw some as a child. Growing up, I would go to large family gatherings, the kind where everyone is a tío, uncle, tía, aunt, or primo, cousin, even if they really weren't. So at one of these family gatherings, I must have been around 15 years old at the time, there was a large group of younger primas. The group consisted of about 6 or so primas, female cousins, ranging from 5 to 12 years old. You would always see them playing together, always smiling, always happy. So at this particular family gathering, I noticed the oldest one, I'll call her Jackie, off in a corner watching the primas play. She had a despondent look on her face which I had never seen before. I asked her what was the matter, and she'd shake her head. I left her alone for a while, and later on she approached me and said that she could tell me, but that I wouldn't believe her. I told her I'd try my best to believe her, and she told me that she'd tell me, but she didn't care if I did or not. She appeared almost scared to tell me. So her story goes that she saw duendes creep into her room that she shared with her younger sister. She said she saw 4 duendes come into her room from her open window, climb up her dresser, take something and leave. I'm sure she gave other details, but it's been too long to remember. I'd love to ask her now as an adult, but it's been years since I've seen or heard of her. At 15, my first impression was that she was making all this up, but I found it strange that she would lie. I found the way she told me strange. This girl seemed genuinely scared of the experience she had had. The next story I heard was when I was around 18 years old from my best friend's mum, who grew up in Bolivia, close to the jungle. She said that as a little girl, she was lured into the jungle by being put into a trance-like state by duendes. She remembers feeling that the duendes wanted to play with her, so she followed them towards the jungle, and was only snapped out of the trance by her younger sister, who had grabbed her before entering the thick of the jungle. This was an honest woman, well into her 50s, who said things as they were. My last story comes from a good friend of mine who I believe to be honest, with a good head on her shoulders. It's my girlfriend, actually. The story she told me comes from the Philippines. So, about 10 years ago, she visited the Philippines, and while staying at an aunt's house, she noticed her younger cousin behaving oddly. She mentions it to her aunt, who told her that her cousin plays with duendes. They also call them duendes in the Philippines. When asking her cousin, who was around 7 years old, about the duendes, she told her that she would play with them out near the bushes. She told her the duendes would get mad if she refused to play with them. They would at times hold her back from returning to her house when her mother called, but they wanted to continue playing with her. They even hurt her at times. The aunt confirmed that she had seen them and had been trying to figure out a way to shield her daughter from the duendes. My girlfriend's aunt told her recently that if she asked her daughter about it now, she wouldn't recall any of it. Perhaps due to the trauma of those experiences? Who knows? Accounts of duendes, gnomes, or little people come from all over the world. I've just mentioned some from 4 different countries, 2 different continents. I don't believe them to be a work of literary fiction, but a creature we have yet to officially place. I hope this post brings others to share their experiences. Thanks for listening. I was visiting Honduras and was discussing the paranormal with my cousins. They said they've never seen a ghost, but everyone had a duende story. The most interesting was about a schoolmate of my cousin's. So my cousin's schoolmate was a beautiful blonde girl. Beautiful inside and out, not conceited. Super sweet and friends with everyone, especially the town losers, my cousin being one of them. She had a duende that was following her since she was 8. He was obsessed with her and would throw rocks at any boy that tried to date her. As she grew older, it got annoying that her suitors would be scared away by this rock-throwing elf. My cousin told her to tell the elf to go away, and she said, "Any man scared of an elf is not worthy of my affections." Well, fast forward to her being a 30-year-old virgin. She got a boyfriend who was not afraid of the elf and continued to date, even though this elf messed with him a lot. Throwing rocks, stealing his keys, leaving nails around his car. She lost her virginity to him, and apparently the elf was so disgusted he finally left her alone. Another story comes from my grandmother. When she was 40, doctors told her she'd be completely blind by the age of 50. She's very religious and not superstitious at all, but was desperate to save her eyesight. Well, a neighbor told her about a herbalist living in the mountains of Copan, who had a whistling duende as her assistant. My grandmother went with her friend to visit the woman. She told the woman what the doctor had said about her eyes, and the woman translated to the duende by whistling. My grandmother and her friend said they didn't see the duende, but they did hear the duende whistle back in response. The duende whistled to the woman to give my grandmother some herbs he gathered. My grandmother took the strange herbs, and although her eyesight did not get better, it did not get worse. She passed away at 70, with the same eye prescription she had at 40. Last story. A friend of mine said she had a witch for a grandmother. While staying at Grandma's witch hut, she would tell my friend and her sister to stay away from the tree because a duende lived there. The stories go that the duendes will steal little blonde girls. My friend said she didn't believe in witches or elves and thought her grandmother made up the story to keep the girls close to the house. One afternoon, they were playing hide and seek near the tree to be naughty. After counting to 10, she saw something run behind the tree and followed it, thinking it was her sister. She found her sister staring wide-eyed at something, and it was a duende. She was 10 at the time, and it was shorter than her. It had a pointy red hat and a super wrinkled face, almost like an opossum, and was smiling ear to ear. It reached over to grab her little sister, who was blonde. But she grabbed her sister first, and they took off running to the house. When they got to the house, they told their grandmother about the duende, and she simply said, "I told you to stay away from that tree." Listen to your witch grandma, people. When my mum was around 2, her parents would leave her in the crib, in the room nearby the kitchen. So to give a visualization, my grandparents' kitchen in Mexico has 2 doors. One that leads to the yard, that was not fenced, and they had a few acres with a river going through it and lots of mango trees, just to give you an idea of how big their land was. And the other door leads to their living room, where my mother's baby crib was. That living room also leads to another part of their yard, so regardless, when you leave their home, you are either going into a forest or going into more forest at that time. Now, of course, most of that forest is torn down now since my grandparents sold most of their land. So my mum told me that her mother had set her down in the crib and left her alone for a few minutes. She went to the kitchen to do something, and when she came back to get my mother was gone. there was dirt and little handprints in the crib. My grandmother and the rest of the family formed a search party to go look for her. Mind you, this is Mexico. It's very common for multiple family members to live in the same house, especially this one since my grandma and grandpa built this house themselves and they have 8 children, with my mum being the 3rd youngest. So a search party ensues, and they can't find my mum. They're searching for hours and they finally decide to return home. My grandma is in tears, and upon returning to the house with everyone, there's my mum crying in her crib, covered in dirt and more little handprints around the crib and on her clothes. So of course this could be anything, maybe kids of another family, and there is no proof that she was taken by duendes and then brought back. But whose kids decided to sneak into my grandmother's house? There was so much land back then, and these handprints were little. My grandmother has described them as belonging to a toddler. So how could a toddler pull a 2-year-old out of the crib? But multiple duendes could. They were notoriously known for mischief, and in Mexico, there were tales of duendes kidnapping children. So my grandma still to this day thinks that it was them who took my mum, maybe to go play or something, and then brought her back unharmed but covered in dirt. I also have a story from my uncle. So my uncle has always been very calm and collected and just peaceful. I don't know, it's weird to describe his reaction when I asked about his experience. So when I was 13, I was in Mexico visiting the family, and I remember hearing about these duendes, and I was so curious and wanted to hear about it from my uncle himself. I just shouldn't have even asked. It triggered him. He had fear in his eyes and just looked visibly upset. He told me, "No, I'm not talking about this." Me being ashamed and guilty for bringing this fear on him, dropped it and walked away. Later that evening, my uncle took my aunt, my mum, and my 2 sisters and I to a restaurant in another pueblo. So we're at dinner and my uncle apologizes for reacting the way he did. Mind you, I'm the one who brought the fear upon him. He then proceeds to tell me that he just didn't want to speak about them at his house. The same house my grandparents built. The same house my mother was kidnapped when she was 2. So here is his story. He's at his friend's house. They're smoking a cigarette outside, enjoying the weather and just hanging out. My uncle gets this strange feeling of being watched. He ignores the feeling. His friend goes inside to grab a drink, and my uncle is out there alone. He looks around and sees a small man. The way he described this to me was that this little man was about a foot or so tall, and dressed like an elf or a leprechaun. Very fairy tale-ish. So he's just in shock, staring. He doesn't even believe it himself, and he's just staring. This little man, a duende, gives my uncle a smile, but not a friendly smile. More of a grin of, "You see me, this is true, and I'm here to enlist fear." My uncle is frozen, and out comes his friend, who drops his drink. His friend screams, and my uncle looks over at him, and right there they both know they're both seeing exactly the same thing. No hallucination. They turn to look at the duende, and the duende is calling them over with a hand gesture. My uncle looks at his friend and tells him, "Vámonos," like, "let's run." So they dart out of the patio and run to a car and drive off. They're scared shitless. My uncle drives them to his house. His friend wasn't going to stay at his house alone, so of course he stayed the night. My uncle lives at my grandma's house, so fast forward, the rest of my family is home and they can see that they're shaken up. They ask what's going on, and my uncle refuses to speak because he's superstitious and believes that if you speak about them, they'll appear or hear you. Being convinced that he's safe and not in danger, he tells the family about what happened. Of course, everyone believes him because in Mexico, speaking of duendes isn't uncommon. It's like speaking of La Llorona. So my uncle's room is on the 3rd floor of my grandma's house. From the 3rd floor, you can overlook most of the land. So he's up there smoking with his friend again, and they both just avoid talking about what happened. So they're having a smoke, and my uncle gets overwhelmed with the same feeling he had earlier. The feeling of not being alone. He tells his friend that they should just step back in. So my uncle goes inside with his friend, and my uncle tells him that he's going to go downstairs. The friend goes to sleep, and my uncle goes downstairs to make his way to the yard. My uncle has always been super in tune. I personally think everyone has a sixth sense, and maybe my uncle's ability to be able to see and communicate with the paranormal is his. He goes outside and looks out into the land. We all know what he's looking for. He's keeping an eye out, and there it is. So what he describes this time is that the duende is sitting on this tree. This duende is sitting with his legs crossed and makes a hand gesture to my uncle saying, "Come here." My uncle nearly shits himself from how scared he is. He can't believe that he's seeing the same little man. He said that he yelled at it to go away and leave them alone. The duende jumps up and walks away. My uncle goes back inside the house and wakes his friend up, and he tells him about the incident. Both are scared shitless and stay up. The next day they tell my grandma. After this they go to the church to get a blessing. Everything's fine for a couple of months, until it visited again. My uncle was having dreams about this duende coming to visit him and offer an exchange to him. Of course, dreams can be anything. They can be from our brains thinking about something or someone constantly. I know we have dreams with scenarios with people in movies and celebrities. You get the point. So, more time passes and the duendes reappear. My uncle said that it was the same damn tree and he's standing on it, but this time he's holding a little bag. What is presumed that's in the bag is money. My uncle was telling us about the exchanges, so that was creepy. I literally got chills thinking about this. What if this thing is trying to communicate with him through his dreams? At this point my uncle is scared beyond belief. I think if I remember this part correctly, he said he was crying and yelling at it, saying to leave him alone and to leave his family alone. The duende cracks a smile again and leaves. My uncle sobs and looks up, and it's actually gone. So my uncle said that was the last time he saw it for a while. I'm going to have to call my mum and ask for the rest of the story because this is all I remember. But from what I recall, I think he saw it once more and then moved out of my grandma's and went to go live with a friend in a different city. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. If you liked that video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. A huge thank you to all the Reddit users who allowed me to use their stories. A link to each story will be in the description below. If you have a story you'd like to share on my channel, please send it to my email, which is also in the description below. As always, thank you all so much for your continued support. I really do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.